The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel tells us that the number one predictor of financial success is our behavior. So let's dive into it. Hey everyone, welcome to the channel. Today I want to talk about Morgan Housel's book, The Psychology of Money. Let's talk about its main arguments, the general structure, and do a deep dive into some of the details of each of the arguments that he makes. So the main theme of the book, or the main argument that Housel is making here, is that becoming wealthy and having financial success generally follows good behaviors around money and a few external factors that we can't really control. So with external factors, that's things like, for example, the financial institutions of the country that you're in. So the fact that in the US we have 401ks, Roth IRAs, that those are the investment accounts that exist and we don't really have any control over them. But then also things like when a recession happens, when there's an economic boom, when there's an economic downturn, just things that are generally outside of our control. And when he talks about good behavior, he really talks about two main things. And that's one is developing and fostering these good habits around money. And two is avoiding these sort of like bad habits around money. Okay, so let's dive into some of the good habits that Housel talks about in the book. The first one that he talks about is trying to redefine and shift our framework of how we think about wealth. So one way to think about this is understanding that wealth can be thought of as freedom of choice. So that's the freedom to choose when I want to work, when I want to hang out with my friends, when I want to come back home, when I want to just take a stroll in the park and read a book. So it's the freedom to be able to decide and choose when we do these things, control of our time. And another way to think about wealth is about, given our current expenditures, so how much we spend in a month, how long can I sustain this current lifestyle without having to generate any additional income? So for example, let's assume that I spend about $1,000 each month. So this second idea, or the second way of thinking about wealth, is really thinking, okay, so if I were to go for the rest of my life without generating any additional income besides my current assets and whatever I have in investments, how long could I sustain this current lifestyle? That idea really gets at when can we get to a point where we have enough in investments and we have enough in assets to where we can sustain our level of living and our standard of living without having to generate any additional income. These ways of thinking about money help us kind of like open up our understanding and say, okay, well, maybe what we're pursuing isn't to make as much money as possible, or isn't to as many nice coats or as many nice cars as possible, but rather this sort of like freedom of choice and this ability to maintain a lifestyle that is healthy, that is productive, and that really reinforces us as an individual and what we want to do with our lives. So the second good habit that Housel really talks about is this idea of compounding. The basic idea here is that when we invest money, we can take advantage of interest and compounding to make significant gains over the long term. The basic idea is that I invest X amount into some sort of investment vehicle that earns interest, so an investment account or something of that sort. And I earn interest on that initial amount that I invested. The idea is that I reinvest that interest that I earned, such that in the next period, I earn interest both on the initial amount that I originally invested plus the interest that I earned in the first pay period. So the key idea here is compounding interest allows our investments to grow exponentially over time because there's this effect of continual growth and stacking interest on top of interest on top of interest. And the main ideas here are to think about money and wealth as a long-term game, things that we can make small, tiny changes to right now, but that will really have significant rewards and significant gains 10, 20, 30 years down the line. And so the third thing that Housel talks about is understanding this idea of long tails. So these are rare and unanticipated events that actually are huge drivers of the total outcome. These are things that are unpredictable, that we can't really foresee or have foresight into, but that really dramatically impact either our financial portfolio or our financial systems or the economy at large. Things like a recession, things like a boom, things that, like a war, things that we can't really control, but that'll have like huge impacts on our financial portfolios and our financial systems. The main idea here is that there are going to be huge things that really impact the way our finances look and that we can't anticipate beforehand. And so we need to adopt this mentality of humility, knowing that what we have right now may not exist, a week down the line or even tomorrow, but also this mindset of flexibility, which is the idea that regardless of what happens, we're going to position ourselves such that we're able to adapt, such that we're able to be flexible and be agile to adjust to whatever sort of unprecedented and unpredictable events come our way. And so that's with the idea of diversifying our investments, to have money in different places, but then also to have a savings account and to plan for the long term and to have an emergency fund, all these things that are going to help us be extremely resilient, but also flexible in the face of adversity or just unpredicted events in general. Okay, so we've kind of drilled into some of the good habits that Housel talks about, the good habits that will then lead to good behavior. But the second part of that is also understanding, okay, what are the bad habits that we want to avoid? So let's talk about that a little bit. The way Housel kind of breaks it down is there's two main types of bad habits. The first are sort of like emotional bad habits, and the second are bad habits that really stem from misinformation or about not having enough information about financial topics. So let's first talk about some of these emotional bad habits. The first one is really social comparison. And this is the idea that we look at someone who's purchased something, or we look at our friends, or we look at the people in our life, and we feel like we need to play catch up, or we feel like we constantly need to prove ourselves or compare ourselves to, what they have, what their financial situations look like. But realistically, every person is their own individual. They have their own financial goals, they have their own financial plans, and they have their own timelines for which they're making their financial decisions. And so ultimately, everyone is playing a different game. They're playing a different game based off of the goals and the priorities and the values that they have. And so we might be able to see when someone purchases like a house or an apartment or something really flashy, but we actually are only getting a small snippet into the overall picture that is their financial system and their methods and approach towards their finances. And so the idea here is that, okay, understanding that when we look into when we get a glimpse into other people from their purchase decisions or from what they're wearing or these more external or extrinsic sort of factors, the idea is understanding that we're actually only getting a really small glimpse into the overall financial picture, and understanding that at the end of the day, we're playing very, very different games from one person to another, even from your friends and your family members, and to try and avoid as much as possible this temptation to socially compare. And I get it. I mean, it's really tough. It's extremely difficult to do. I think especially when you're younger and, you feel like you feel the pressure that you need to, make so much money as soon as possible. You need to set yourself up on a really good career plan. You need to have everything figured out. But I think the more that we can try and train ourselves to step away from that social comparison, the more that we're able to focus on our own goals, our own priorities, and make the most productive financial decisions for ourselves that are going to help us get to our goals. The second emotional factor that Housel talks about is this idea of allowing our ego to approach our income. And so we all know that, you have your income and you have your expenditures, and everything in between is your savings or your wealth and how much you're accumulating within your financial system, right? The idea here is trying to limit as much as possible how much we allow our ego to drive our expenditures and our spending all the way up to our income. And I guess this really ties back to the previous point of social comparison, but the idea is that we don't need to, there are things that we'll buy, there are things that we'll purchase that we take a deeper look, we, wear our magnifying glass and really inspect, that we realize that we're only purchasing these things because we want to portray a certain image, or that we want to give off a certain vibe, or that we want to impress a certain someone. But this may not actually be in line with our actual financial goals, especially if we go back to the initial understanding of what wealth is, right? Being able to have the freedom, the opportunity to choose, but then also being able to sustain and maintain a lifestyle that works for ourselves and that we can keep and maintain over a long period of time. And I think part of this is honestly also just a really American thing, but it's this attachment of self-worth, your identity, your personal value to your financial status, to your income, to how much you have in your bank account. And I think we all could do a better job of reminding ourselves that we are not our financial successes. We are not our financial failures. Those two things are simply tools that we can use towards working towards our personal goals and our personal values. That's essentially what money is. It's a tool to allow us to work towards our personal goals and values, but it's not something that defines us. It's not something that defines, it's not something that defines us. It's not something that measures how much we're worth, how much value we have. And I mean, it's difficult, I think, in the society that we live in today. But I think, again, the more we can do to remind ourselves that we are not our financial choices, we are not our financial our finances, our financial system, and that wealth is a means for achieving our individual and personal goals. And it's not a scoreboard or some card that we need to compare to every single person that we interact with, or all the people in our lives. And I think when we can take that approach, we end up having a more positive and healthy relationship, and being able to compartmentalize our finances and say, these are things and this is a system that I'm building in order to achieve these personal goals and values that actually define who I am as a person. So we've talked about the emotional bad habits that Housel talks about. So that's social comparison and also ego-driven spending. The next thing I want to talk about is the misinformation aspect of bad habits. So the first thing Housel talks about with misinformation is this idea of overgeneralizing. And that's the idea that we need to understand that at the end of the day, we're one person amongst, 7-8 billion people that exist in the world. And the financial experiences that we have, whether it's with investing accounts, whether it's with getting a job, whether it's with career, only really represents a small fraction of all the financial experiences that people have in the world. And so, of course, there are going to be trends, there are going to be commonalities amongst all these experiences. But the idea being that our specific experience is unique and specific to us, and that we should understand the cognitive biases that are associated with taking that experience and trying to overgeneralize it to the world as a whole. In reality, the unique experience that we have is small. It's only a fraction of the experience that someone could interact with, that someone could have. And just understanding things with that kind of perspective that, our relationship with money is actually only one of however many of millions of billions of interactions with money that people all around the world have. And the second idea of misinformation is just the idea that so many of these financial institutions and financial systems are actually quite new. So, for example, like something like Social Security was only really developed after World War II, so it was less than 100 years old. Something like the Roth IRA account only started off in 1998. Something like the 401k account, the two main investment vehicles that Americans can put their money into to grow long-term savings and tax-advantaged retirement accounts, are new. The 401k came out in 1978. Like the Roth IRA came out in 1998. These things are, the Roth IRA is basically my age. Like it's basically as old as me. How can I expect my parents to have a robust and thorough understanding of it when it's such a new concept that was only just being defined and introduced to the American population and the general public when they first came to America and came to the United States? Like these are new things that we're learning about and that we're learning how to take advantage of and how to really make the best use of. And that it takes time to learn those things. And as a result, like we need to be careful of the misinformation that exists and do our best to try and educate and understand these things for what they are and how we can improve and take advantage of the systems that are in place. To rehash, The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel basically tells us that knowledge and having information about money, understanding how money works, isn't enough. That instead, in order to get to a point of financial independence, to get to a point of financial success and wealth, that we really have to cultivate these good behaviors around money. Because you can have all the knowledge, you can have all the understanding, but at the end of the day, we are emotional beings. We are beings that suffer from cognitive and psychological biases, and we have to understand that we make so many of our financial decisions in times when we're under emotional distress or when we're not thinking the most rationally. And so what we have to do is cultivate these habits and cultivate these good practices so that when we are in those emotionally unpredictable environments, we have a baseline and a set of behaviors and habits that we can fall back on that are generally going to lead us in the right direction, that are going to lead us towards freedom, the ability to choose, towards financial success, and towards, financial lives that we can be proud of, that we're happy with, and that help us reach our personal and individual goals. And that's kind of like the thesis of his book. And I hope that this video was able to give like a deep dive, but also give the structure of his main arguments, of his main points, and paint it in a way that I think is easy to absorb for a watcher or someone who's watching. I hope that using these mind maps and using these sorts of visuals are helpful for understanding how I think about books and how I like to dissect them and ingest and digest them. And I hope that you're able to, get something out of this and take my sort of like structure and skeleton and make it your own and use it to understand the book. Maybe if you want to go read it. Thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next video.